How powerful are our conceptions? What can we conceive to be true? Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix. I'm super stoked because today I'm going to talk about Saint Anselm as part of my Philosopher Series, so without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, I have been talking about a variety of different philosophers from the ancient times to the Middle Ages. I'm covering philosophers that wrote in ancient and medieval times so far for my Philosopher Series, and I decided that the next philosopher that I wanted to cover was Saint Anselm. Now, I have this old beat-up copy of the Proslogian, and the text itself by the Penguin Classics is the Prayers and Meditations of Saint Anselm, which would include the Proslogian. And I thought that I would discuss Saint Anselm's philosophy. Now, the Middle Ages produced very interesting philosophy, you could say. I've covered St. Augustine already, and he was from the Middle Ages, and as you may remember from that episode, there was a lot of talk about religion and what that means for philosophy itself as a tradition. And the thing that is interesting to note is that Anselm was also religious in his arguments, and that is what I hope to delve into today to see how it connects to the larger picture of philosophy. So as I said, St. Anselm wrote the Proslogian, and the best way to describe his work is to describe the form. So there are a lot of different ways of writing philosophy. As we've seen, we can have more formal argumentation, such as with philosophers like Aristotle. We can have dialogues, such as with Plato. And we can also have poems and poetry, such as we've seen with Parmenides and Horace. And so there are a lot of ways to do philosophy. But it seems as though a new genre that is emerging from this time period of the Middle Ages and philosophy as a tradition is meditations. So what is a meditation? That is a good question. The term is definitely familiar when thinking about the Stoics, specifically Marcus Aurelius, and it's a very good question to ask. And so meditations in this case are very much almost prayers. They may as well be prayers because they are communicating to God. And even though their work is philosophical in the sense of argumentation and in the sense of promoting abstract ideas and being able to describe abstract ideas, it's very interesting to think that the form has changed a little bit because now we have a philosopher who is focusing very much on talking to God and communicating with his philosophy. And so he still does present arguments, but it's very interesting to think that the way in which philosophy has been written thus far has changed and developed even further, and is definitely influenced by Christianity. Now, a term that I want to go over is ontology. Ontology is the study of being and becoming, of existence, and of understanding what reality is through our experience of it. And what is really remarkable to think about is that ontology very much studies what exists and what we can say exists. And so Anselm is setting out to show through his conceptions that God exists. And this has been called the Ontological Argument, which is a very religious argument that argues that God exists. It is the idea that God exists because we can imagine him existing. So when someone says something like, "What's perfect must exist," that is very much an ontological statement and borrows from the ontological argument. And the reason why it does that is because it's thinking about what exists. And specifically with the ontological argument, we're thinking about what we can conceive. And specifically with the ontological argument, we are thinking about the nature and being and existence of God. And so ontology is very much an important part of this picture because we are thinking of being. We are thinking about what exists. And ontology is a very important branch of discussion because it studies what's possible and is definitely a part of metaphysics, and is thinking about what is really there. And I would say that this is probably the biggest reason why I am interested in the philosophy and approach of Anselm, because it helps me think about what truly exists and how I can think about my arguments about being and becoming, such as we see later on in philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Alfred North Whitehead, who were thinking very much about becoming and process philosophy. But it's very remarkable to think about how we can make our arguments about what exists. And so it's very important to keep in mind that what Anselm is doing is very much an exercise of faith and not reason. He's using the meditations and the form of argumentation in order to affirm his faith. And that is one of the most important elements that you uncover by reading Anselm. Now, it's definitely a complicated thing to think about the existence of God and what that means, whether we do or don't believe. And I'll admit, I struggle with the religious components of Anselm, as I did with Augustine as well. I definitely struggled with some of the religious points as well. And I myself don't describe myself as a religious person. And so it's very interesting to think about Anselm through that lens of a kind of relaxed agnosticism and not really feeling any need to affirm anything. But I have borrowed from Anselm's arguments through some of my ideas, one of which includes my ideas about potential and about possibility and about what exists. When I asked at the beginning of this video what our conceptions can reveal and whether or not they are powerful and whether or not our conceptions are true, it very much influenced my thinking, my philosophical worldview, because I have been thinking about how can I conceive something into reality. So a good metaphor that Anselm uses would be painting. So, for instance, the painter imagines something, he conceives it in his mind, and then he executes that and makes it real. And so that kind of ontological thinking has very much influenced me, and it partly comes from Anselm. But there are difficulties with it. Is it true that what we conceive is true? Is it true that just because we conceive something, that it is true? Can we conceive perfection, for instance, and then make that reality? Is something true just because we think it to be true? And it does get a little bit convoluted, a little bit kind of confusing in a way. But to make this clear, what I would like to emphasize is that I actually don't know the answer to this question. I would like to believe, by using the analogy of the painter or even a writer, for example, it is very possible that we can make something into existence, or something that we think exists could already exist. However, sometimes it also has struck me as being a little bit of a stretch, and I'll give you a counterexample and a counter-argument of this point. If you imagine an island, and the island is perfect, that obviously doesn't mean that the island exists. But this is analogous to what Anselm is arguing. And so another example is looking at a wall doesn't just immediately make it a rose bush just because you conceive of it as a rose bush. It just doesn't work that way. And I have gotten criticisms before with my ontological view by thinking that just because I imagine something doesn't mean that it isn't real or true. And so it might be a little bit specific here with the ontological argument, where Anselm is making an argument of faith rather than just convincing people of something. He even says that he is very much just trying to bolster the faith that people already have, so he's not literally trying to prove God's existence. But there is very much an entanglement there, because when I think about the wall becoming a rose bush, it's not just going to do that just because I think of it as doing that. The perfect island existing doesn't mean that it actually exists. Maybe it exists in some far-off version in the multiverse, but in reality, just like in Plato's forms, you could argue that that higher reality doesn't actually exist. And that is why these arguments are so deeply entwined with the history of philosophy, because we are literally trying to conceive of what is actually true and what is actually real. And I really had to wrestle with my notions of possibility and thinking about what is actually true. I've had to think that there might be some things that I imagine that may not completely be true, even if I want to create them into existence and imagine them into reality. There's a way in which there is a limit to what we can conceive. Now, a good analogy is, of course, the painter, because the painter can ultimately create something, and that is the idea that I'm asking about whether or not we can conceive something in reality. But the bigger point is that it is a tough question, and there's a fine line between being able to create something into existence and realizing that some things are not actually real. And so this is why Anselm is a very interesting philosopher, and why he is important to cover in the history of philosophy. And so that is the question. Is thought the same as reality? And it's really hard to say. But I would say that thought, despite my criticisms, can definitely be embodied in the world in some way if we are willing to try to make them reality in some way. And that is why I find these arguments to be very interesting. Now I wanted to comment. I remember studying Anselm in class at the University of Utah, where one person who was very religious actually thought that Anselm's argument was very dumb. As he said in his own words, that it was a dumb argument. What's really interesting is, as I said, it's more about faith rather than just convincing someone of something. But I do think that this individual missed out on the beauty and implications and wonder that the ontological view and vein allows us to consider. Because as a person who's very interested in what's possible, that is why I'm agnostic. Because I want to think of infinity, and I want to think of possibility, and I want to think of powerful processes and us becoming, not just being. I want us to see things in this beautiful realm of reality as constantly creating itself and constantly becoming more and more of itself and constantly developing. And I find that to be really inspiring. And so I actually don't think it's a dumb argument. Even though I myself, as I said, I don't identify as religious, I think that it is nonetheless a very remarkable argument because of what it gets us to think about. What do we conceive to be real? What do we make reality through our conceptions? How powerful are our conceptions? What can we make to be real? And I think that it's very remarkable. There is a beauty and symmetry to these arguments, and even though Anselm knows that he's not trying to convince anyone, he very much presents it because he had something that he was trying to convey. He had something that he was trying to express, and it was his way of tapping into what he really believed. And so this is what his philosophy makes me think of. It makes me think of what is actually true in the world. What is being? What is ontology? And those are definitely the questions that I ask. Now, ultimately, I'm not the biggest, except for the arguments that I've made, I'm not the biggest undertaker of Anselm's philosophy. I do enjoy Plato more, for example, and I do struggle with some medieval philosophers because I know that they were definitely in a different mindset, and they were thinking about these questions in the context of the rising of Christianity and deep beliefs in God. And so I do struggle with those arguments because I think that I don't have an immediate relation to it because I myself don't identify as religious. But as I've said, there is a beauty in the arguments that are presented. It's about understanding what's being said and understanding what's being communicated, and that is one of the great things that you get out of philosophy, is being able to just analyze arguments and look at different points of view. And that is where I think the value is, because I think Anselm is really just trying to think and conceive what is real and what can we perceive as real and what is worth conceiving. And I never want to underestimate the power of what we can conceive. I never want to underestimate the power of the mind and what is possible. And that is why I identify as agnostic, because I want to believe in these infinite possibilities. I want to believe that things aren't limited, that there is in some way a higher existence, that there is in some way a higher being of humanity, but maybe even something more universal. And yeah, it's a very powerful thing. And so even if I might be a little at odds with some of Anselm's arguments, I nonetheless find them to be very fascinating. And I imagine things in the world as being open to change through this process of becoming, through ontology, through being as not being so fixed. And I just find that to be very fascinating. I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.